UK inflation is running higher than many of its main competitors. Inflation last month in the UK was 3.4%, compared to 1.9% in Europe, just 0.9% in France, and 2.4% in the United States. Now, the UK inflation does partly reflect temporary factors, but these temporary factors seem to have an increasingly permanent feel. Higher UK inflation is not a new phenomenon. Since 2016, the UK has had consistently higher inflation than the Eurozone. Since the start of 2016, UK prices have increased by 36%, whilst prices in the Eurozone have increased just 27%. Now, in the United States, the price level has increased at a similar rate to the UK, but with a big difference. The US economy has been growing quite rapidly, whilst the UK economy has largely stagnated. If you look at taking into account population growth, GDP per capita almost stagnant in the past 4 or 5 years. Now, on the positive side, inflation has come down significantly from that 2022 peak when it reached 10%. But a fall in the inflation rate has done little to inspire confidence. According to a More in Common survey, a near record 49% of people are not sure that the cost of living crisis will ever end. Consumer confidence remains relatively low, and there is good evidence to suggest that ordinary households view inflation in a different way to perhaps economists do. In 2024, US inflation had fallen to 2.5%, yet respondents claimed inflation was their biggest economic problem. There seemed to be a disconnect. Well, firstly, the inflation rate measures the change in the cost of living over the past 12 months. But ordinary households tend to compare prices over a longer time period, 2, 3 or 4 years. For example, most people won't be able to tell you the current rate of CPIH inflation, but they can tell you that before COVID they could do their weekly shopping for under £100, but now it costs closer to £150, and that's with smaller chocolate bars too. If we look at the 4-year inflation rate, it is close to 27%, which means prices have risen 27% in the past 4 years, the highest level since the early 90s. Another way of showing this past inflation is to look at the Consumer Price Index, and this reflects perhaps more widely how we actually view prices in ordinary life. A fall in the inflation rate just means prices are increasing at a slower rate, but the crucial thing is they are still a lot more expensive than a few years ago. Just this morning I go into Cafe Nero for a coffee whilst writing this, and I invariably say to myself, I remember when I first came here in about 2004, a cappuccino was £1.80. Today it's £3.80. That's a 110% increase. The other aspect of inflation is that there can be a big variety in what increases prices. In the cost of living crisis of 22-23, it was food that was one of the biggest jumps in prices. Food inflation reached nearly 20%. And this is both psychologically very important, but also a big component of spending by low-income households. And it's no surprise that high food prices caused a dismal month for supermarkets last month, with retail sales falling in May at the fastest pace for a year. Also, another interesting thing is this study done by the IMF into official inflation and what people actually experience. The authors claim that the sharp jump in borrowing costs, especially for housing, created a disconnect between inflation statistics and consumer sentiment. The authors argue that if you include home and vehicle purchases, then the US inflation rate would have been 14% rather than the official figure of 4.1% in 2023. It's rather a stark contrast. Now, in the UK, we have CPIH, which includes owner-occupying housing costs, which in recent months has been significantly higher than CPI. But when calculating these housing costs, the ONS used something called rental equivalence. It does not include mortgage interest payments or the cost of buying a house. So when my fixed rate of 2% ended in 2023 and my mortgage jumped £200 a month, this was not picked up by the official inflation measures. Now, if we look at RPI in the past 12 months, it is housing that is by far the biggest increase in price pressures for many people. Now, apart from housing, if we look at the big impact on the cost of living in the past 3 years, well, the big shock has come from energy, from electricity and gas. And this helps to explain why the UK has been more adversely affected by the cost of living than other European countries, because electricity is relatively more expensive in the UK than anywhere else. Now, the good news is that since the start of the year, oil prices fell, meaning that the next energy price cap in August will be lower, though still 42% higher than back in 2021. Now, this will in theory help to reduce inflation in autumn, but the bad news is that just literally in the past few weeks, oil prices have soared once again, giving the UK yet another potential cost of living headache. And the problem is that when oil and gas prices rise, it's not just higher petrol prices, but more expensive food and electricity. Higher energy prices makes it more expensive to heat greenhouses for growing food and also transporting food. But the biggest problem really is that the main determinant of electricity prices in the UK is the price of natural gas. Now, why is this? Well, it's a bit of a long story. The renewable share of electricity has increased in recent years, but often we still need gas to provide that last 1 or 2% of electricity to the grid. So in the UK system, the price of gas determines the price we pay for all forms of electricity. If gas prices rise, we pay more for wind energy. Yet, if it is too windy and we can't deal with the wind generated in Scotland, we also pay wind producers to turn off the turbines. In 2023, we then tried to claw back some of this excess profit through a 45% windfall tax on older wind farms. Suffice to say, it's all a bit of a mess. Now, there are many reasons for this, and it's hard to get into all of them, but in brief, underinvestment in nuclear, underinvestment in the grid, less integration with Europe since Brexit, green levies, privatisation, a system which rewards high-cost producers, a lack of regional pricing. We could go on, but the immediate problem is that the UK cost of living is highly dependent on the price of gas and oil. Now, JP Morgan warned that in a worst-case scenario of oil disruption from a Middle East conflict, oil prices could rise to $120 to $130, a level last seen in 2022. Now, hopefully that won't happen, but if it did, it would be 2022 all over again. Now, if we look at some manufactured goods like electronic goods and clothes, the inflation rate has been significantly lower in recent decades, and this has been helped in large part by cheap Chinese exports. And by the way, China is slipping into deflation as a result of the trade war of the United States, which may mean more cheap imported Chinese goods, so at least one silver lining to the clouds over us. But another point is that last month I had to buy a new computer with more memory to make sure I could export these videos without some of the glitches that creeped in recent months. Sorry about that. Anyway, the point is it was 30% more expensive than a MacBook I got in 2022. Now, in theory, inflation takes into account changes in the quality of products. But if I was taking off my economist hat and getting into my ordinary person's hat, I do get this sense I was pushed into spending £1,400 because of a very quick obsolescence of many electronic goods. I'm sure my first computer at BBC with 32k of memory lasted longer than some of these modern Apple computers. Anyway, but electric goods are really a sideshow to the biggest cost of living pressures, which have been housing for most UK citizens. Now, we have frequently covered housing, but rents rising faster than inflation are really eating into people's disposable income. And if it wasn't for all the suppressed household formation, i.e. people living with their parents for longer, there would be even more upward pressure on prices. 49% of the population pessimistic about the cost of living, and given the outlook for house prices and rents, I, to a large extent, understand this pessimism. And by the way, if you're a young recent graduate leaving with an average of £50,000 student debt, this is another big cost of living pressure, much higher than in the past, but higher student loan repayments are not included in the measure of inflation, so another thing that may be underestimated, actual cost of living, especially for young people. Now, despite the government announcing £16 billion of investment in social housing, the impact on housing costs will be pretty slow and limited to arrive. Earlier this year, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation predict that if you take into account housing costs, the average household will be worse off by the end of a decade. And this is really the big story, housing costs wiping out any minor increase in real wages. Now, in the past 2 years, real wages have actually increased as workers have recovered some of their lost pay from 2022. But even the OBR predict that this real wage growth will soon slow to a trickle. And historically, the OBR have actually been a little over-optimistic about growth prospects in the UK. Now, another interesting aspect of the UK economy at the moment is a big rise in saving ratio. And this is a reflection of the increasing number of economic shocks, and also perhaps an expectation of higher taxes. Because the government is in something of a fiscal bind. It wants to make big spending commitments like raise housing spending, raise defence spending to 3% of GDP, increase health and increase investment in the economy. But a lot of these have not actually been costed. There's a vague hope that economic growth will pick up and the government will get more tax revenue. But the trend in recent months and years really is that borrowing has often come in higher than expected. And using the government's own fiscal rules, this could mean that come October, there'll be pressure to either increase taxes or find some spending cuts, which will be really difficult to do. Taxes as a share of GDP, of course, have been rising and may probably keep going up. Now, where did it all go wrong for the UK economy? The 1970s and 1980s and 1990s? I really enjoyed making these historical videos about different decades. Check this one out from the 1980s. It was a wild ride which has many consequences we're seeing even today. Thanks for watching. Do subscribe and enjoy the hot weather.